Welcome and aloha. I'm Mark Shklov, the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea program. Today we're going across the sea to meet Lawrence Repeta. Lawrence Repeta is currently in Seattle, Washington. He's a graduate of the University of Washington School of Law, but he's spent much of his professional life across the sea in Japan. Lawrence Repeta is a former professor of law at Meiji University, and the core topic of his study has been and continues to be Japan's constitution. He's also been the plaintiff in a landmark case before Japan's Supreme Court and an author of a book titled Japan's Prisoner of Conscience. I've asked Professor Repeta to share his insights with us about all of these topics in a very short time. Welcome. Welcome, Professor. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for the very fine introduction, Mark. It's good to be here with you.
Well, thank you for being my guest today. And before we get into these deep topics, I want to ask you a few questions about your personal background and your relationship with Japan. How did that get started? What caused your interest in Japan, and how did you get there, and how was it to live there?
Well, I've lived in Japan for a very long time. In fact, most of my adult life I've spent in Tokyo. But it started a long time ago. I was sent to Japan by the United States government during the Vietnam War era. So I was in the U.S. Marine Corps, stationed at a military base in Western Japan. I came back to the United States and started to study Japanese and ultimately built a career out of it.
Okay, and your experience apparently was very positive in Japan, and you enjoyed your life there?
Japan's a great country. It's a wonderful place to live. You know, the people are just, they're just good to be with. They're diligent, hardworking, honest. The food is good, and it's a beautiful country to visit.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks, for that insight. Now, I really want to focus on your core topic of your scholarly life in Japan, Japan's constitution, and please give us a little background of your involvement and your interest, and what was the reason for creation of Japan's constitution, and how did it come to be? First of all, to give us a little bit of that background, please.
Well, the story of Japan's constitution is really amazing. Of course, it started with the end of the war in 1945. And for the following period of 7 years, Japan was under military occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. And soon after the war ended, the drafting of a new constitution began. And ultimately, the drafting was finished in 1946, and it took effect in 1947. And the Constitution really brought about a revolution because under the old system, the emperor was viewed as divine. The emperor was the source of sovereign authority and sovereign legal authority in the legal system. The new democratic constitution moved the source of sovereign power from the emperor to the Japanese people themselves.
Okay, so what happened to the emperor?
Well, the emperor, it was at the time, of course, at wartime, it was Emperor Hirohito, and he continued as emperor until I think maybe the early 1970s or thereabout. And then his son became emperor. His son is named Akihito, and he retired about 3 or 4 years ago. Now his son is emperor. His name is Naruhito. And over this period, in particular during the era when Akihito was emperor, it was a period of about 30 years. During that period, I believe that the attitude and personal qualities of Akihito really had a big impact And the office of the emperor and the notion of the emperor took on a very positive image in Japan.
Okay, and so the emperor is no longer the source of all law, I guess, and there's a constitution that governs that. That's what I hear you saying, and you say this is post-war. Was this constitution imposed by the United States government during the post-war occupation, or was this something that came out of Japan's own people?
Well, fundamentally, of course, the starting point is that the Constitution is the supreme source of law, just as the United States Constitution is the highest form of law in our system. So it's the source of law. It took effect in 1947. In 1947, as we were saying, Japan was under military occupation. Japan did not become an independent country again until 1952. So if you think about was the Constitution imposed on Japan or not? I mean, the first basic fact is that Japan was not an independent country at the time. And certainly the occupation authorities, the Allied occupation authorities, had played a very big role in the drafting and in the final adoption of the Constitution.
So what I hear you saying is there's kind of pluses and minuses here, mostly pluses, where the Constitution actually helped Japan recover from post-war and the occupation. That's what I hear. And into the present day. Now, presently, does Japan have a democratic government under the Constitution? Are Japan's government actions transparent and open to public view, or what's the present status?
Well, regarding the Constitution, it's all pluses, right? Because for the first time, we have an actual democratic constitution in which the authority resides with the people. The government is run by officials chosen through democratic elections. The system itself, in the United States, we have a president. In Japan's case, the fundamental model comes from the European system. And so we have a prime minister in Japan and a cabinet that have authority over the executive functions of government. We have essentially a three-branch national government with an elected parliament and an independent judiciary. That system is working today. Like any system, there are critics who are dissatisfied with various aspects of it, but it is a truly democratic government that's operating in Japan today.
Okay, so yeah, pluses, all pluses, and good to hear that. And it is perhaps a system that is, going to continue into the future. But are there any current external or internal threats to the democratic form of government? I mean, I've heard things about Article 9 and possible changes to the Constitution. What's going on there currently?
There are no serious threats to Japan's democratic system. Of course, the future is unpredictable, and there could be shocking events that change the current pattern. But the Japanese government is very stable. Elections are periodically held, and there's little threat to the government itself or to changing the nature of the government from a democratic system. Of course, every country faces difficult issues. The biggest difficult issue in Japan's case is probably the demographic problem. Japan is a rapidly aging society, and the birth rate, like many, as in many industrialized countries, the birth rate has declined dramatically. So Japan is going to have to deal with a population structure in which aged people occupy a much larger portion of the population.
Okay, and have you thoughts about that? How is that going to happen? Does that have any does that have any effect on the role of government?
Well, some people say that in fact Japan's at the leading edge because in many countries we're facing the same kind of demographic kind of time bomb. And in Japan, really, there's quite an extensive set of social services, and in general, the quality of life is very good.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit. I want to move a little bit onto what I've heard about courts and criminal courts, especially in Japan, and your thoughts. I've heard and I've seen, and it's been my experience that most criminal defendants in Japan either plead guilty or are found guilty at trial. Is that, am I right in that? And if so, what does that say about the criminal justice system in Japan?
Yes, it's true that there are very few not guilty verdicts in Japan. And of course, some people explain that by saying that Japanese prosecutors bring the only cases they bring to court are cases where they have the evidence lined up and in a strong case to present. Of course, at the same time, there's a lot of criticism of Japan's. Let me say that again, if I may. At the same time, there's a lot of criticism of Japan's criminal justice system, in particular with regard to the treatment of suspects, individuals arrested and held in police custody, and the nature of the interrogations that take place. I mean, first of all, attorneys are not allowed to be present during interrogations. And second, the interrogations can continue for up to 23 days before an individual is actually formally charged with any crime. It's a very long period of time. And during that period, often suspects are not allowed to have any visitors other than their own attorneys.
Okay, that's an interesting intro that I didn't know about. Good to learn that. Helps explain some things in my mind. And you've been involved in a courtroom case yourself, personally, called the Japan Courtroom Notes Case. What was that about, and how did you get involved, and what happened?
Well, just to kind of finish thoughts about criminal, of course, my case was not a criminal case, but to finish our thoughts about the criminal justice system, as I described it, there's tremendous pressure on suspects to confess, because if they do not confess, they may end up in detention for a very long time, and there's very little prospect of a not guilty verdict. So in a large percentage of cases, individual suspects confess to charges against them. And in some cases, they may not actually be true, but the practical solution from their standpoint may be to confess and be released from custody. I had a very interesting experience in Japan's court system when I was a young man in Tokyo. I visited Tokyo District Courthouse for the first time in the early 1980s, and I took a seat in the spectator section of a criminal justice courtroom, a criminal court in Tokyo, and I was observing a trial. And so I naturally took out my notebook and started to take notes. A guard came over and said, "That's prohibited. You know, you're not allowed to take notes in the courtroom." And I was kind of shocked. This was a public trial. When the doors were open to anyone to come in and sit down and observe the trial. But except for members of the courthouse press club. No one was allowed to take notes.
So what did you do?
Well, I did a couple of things. So the first thing I did was I found out that there was a procedure where I could request the approval of taking notes in the courtroom from the presiding judge. And so I followed that procedure. I filled out a form. I did it 7 times over a period of a couple of months. Japan's trials typically take place over a period of months. In most cases, there's nothing like a jury involved. So the court, for its own, practical reasons, schedules hearings spread out over typically one hearing per month or so. In any case, I applied 7 times to take notes in court hearings. Each time I was rejected, and after that, I thought about, what could I possibly do? Well, it turns out that back in 1947, when the new constitution was adopted, Japan's first democratic constitution, a Japan Civil Liberties Union was formed, the JCLU. And in fact, one of the founders of the ACLU traveled to Japan during that era and met with some Japanese attorneys and legal scholars and others. And they formed a Japan version, the JCLU. So I talked to some JCLU lawyers, and they said, Larry, you've got a good point. This is a public trial. Spectators should be allowed to take notes. So they agreed to represent me. They sought an audience with the presiding judge. He refused that. So our only option left was to file a lawsuit against the government.
And so that's what you did.
That's right. We filed the suit in 1985, and the first judgment came down 2 years later in 1987 at the Tokyo District Court. The court rejected my suit. Of course, our suit was based on the Constitution. Again, 2 provisions were most important. Article 82, which guarantees that courtroom trials will be open to the public, and Article 21, which guarantees the right to free speech. And the right to free speech, my attorneys argued. Again, I had 5 Japan Civil Liberties Union attorneys.
Wow.
Who represented me pro bono.
Nice.
And they did a brilliant job of arguing the free speech aspect of the Constitution. In particular, the fundamental notion that if we have a right to free speech, then we also have a right to listen and to have an audience. And so that when someone is sitting in a courtroom or listening to the courtroom testimony, they're taking notes, they have the right to publish those notes or publish their thoughts based on those notes. And by prohibiting spectators from note-taking, they were limiting the constitutional right to free speech.
And as I understand it, ultimately the Supreme Court of Japan agreed. And
that's right. So the Supreme Court judgment came down in 1989, and the language in the court's decision is very powerful. And it essentially says that except in the most extreme circumstances where the actions of a note taker would really interfere with the court proceedings in some way, except for those extreme circumstances, courts should allow spectators to take notes.
Okay, that all of these combinations within your life in Japan, your professional life, they seem to have added up in a way to a book that you wrote. It occurs to me that your book, Japan's Prisoners of Conscience, which we have a screenshot of, kind of combines a lot of these topics. What was your book about, and we have a few minutes left. I'd like you to kind of tell us what happened with respect to the case involved and the people involved.
Well, the book was just published last year, but it tells the story of some events that occurred during the Iraq War era. So as you may recall, the Iraq War started in 2003, and it was there was really tremendous pressure from the U.S. government against Japan to participate in the war. And this was despite the fact that Article 9 of Japan's constitution really prohibits Japan from engaging in war or using military force to settle international disputes in any way. But it was important to the Japanese government at the time to join that war, and so a small contingent of Japan's self-defense forces were sent to Iraq. This was very unpopular in Japan, and many people protested in different ways. So my book tells the story of three individuals, you can see them on the cover of the book, who were arrested after they distributed flyers, one-page flyers that criticized the war and called upon the self-defense forces not to go to Iraq if they were ordered to do so.
What happened? What happened to them? Those three folks, those three Japanese that took action. I mean, I see them talking about freedom of speech, a constitution, all of these things that you're the perfect person to write the book.
Well, very kind of you to say so, Mark. But it was a very difficult job. All the materials I used were in Japanese, and it took a long time to piece it together. Some people who reviewed the book said, "Larry, I've never heard of this case." In fact, it's little known, and it took place a long time ago, more than 15 years ago. And it's little known because it was not heavily reported. It did not involve any famous people. And the core issue, of course, it's a fascinating issue, right? It's the classic conflict between individual rights, the freedom of speech on one side, and the power of the government, the police power of the government on the other. It's this really classic conflict. But in Japan's case, the Supreme Court has never ruled against the government. The Supreme Court is very conservative. It's extremely hesitant to rule against the government, particularly in an issue like this, an issue that concerned the national security, where the Japanese cabinet, the prime minister, had made the decision to send self-defense forces off to the Iraq war zone.
And your book covers what happened to these three protesters.
That's right. It takes readers from the time of their arrests through the courtroom trial. There were 8 hearings in the first trial, the district court, which is equivalent to the district courts we have in the United States. And then the judgment was not guilty. In fact, if you look at the cover, you see the 3 defendants on the day of that judgment in December of 2004, and they're holding a sign, which in Japanese says, "Not guilty."
Okay.
So the trial took place, again, over a space of 8 hearings from early 2004 until December. The judgment was not guilty. Unfortunately, in the Japanese system, the government is allowed to appeal judgments like that. And it did. And so the not guilty judgment was overturned by the first appellate court, and the Supreme Court of Japan upheld the guilty verdict of the 3 defendants.
And your book tells their story and just published, gets it out there, and talks about it. So we have again some differences in Japan and what happened in the Constitution, or what the Constitution provides and what the courts rule. and where do you see that going?
Well, I think a very important aspect of the book, I mean, of course, on one side, we've described somewhat the police and the prosecutors and their attitude. And, you know, these individuals were held in detention for 75 days for handing out anti-war flyers while they were charged with trespass at the place where they handed out the flyers. But for 75 days, they were held in Japanese jails. As a result, the international human rights group, Amnesty International, designated them prisoners of conscience, which had never been done in Japan before. But the other side of the story, which is very, very important, is that these three individuals found wonderful support among friends and young scholars and attorneys and others. So they were able to, fight the case in court. They were represented by 5 Japanese attorneys. And throughout that time and all the way up to the Supreme Court final judgment, they had the support of local residents in the town where it all happened, and young scholars who actually drafted a long statement which criticized the arrests and so forth. So it showed that there really is a very strong element within the Japanese people. Back to your earlier question about was the Constitution imposed? Well, in the 1940s it was. But during the period from then until now, the Japanese people have taken up the Constitution. It's very popular. And it's become deeply ingrained in Japanese society and in the governmental system.
Well, a lot of what you say gives me some hope. And what are your hopes and aspirations for the future of Japan and its citizens? We have about a minute left. So what are you thinking, based on all your knowledge, your experience, your research, your writings, personal involvement?
Well, as we said at the beginning, really Japan is a wonderful place and it's a wonderful society. It's unique, as anyone who visits Japan knows. It's a very strong culture with a history that is unique. And so one of the really fundamental challenges for Japan is, on one hand, to protect and maintain Japan's unique culture, unique behavior, and character of the Japanese people on the one hand, while on the other hand, integrating with international society. So finding a way to, smoothly work with non-Japanese people, to welcome, non-Japanese businesses and organizations in Japan, to send more Japanese people abroad, and to, again, effectively integrate with international society. I think that's the big fundamental challenge facing Japan.
And it sounds like the people of Japan and it's the people who are friends of Japan are motivated for that ultimate goal. And I've spent a lot of time in Japan myself, and I appreciate what you say. Professor Repeta, thank you very much for being my guest today. I thank you for all your insights. I know we covered a lot in a short period, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. It's really good to work with you, and I look forward to seeing your future episodes.
All right. Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.